I'm not gonna stand here and pretend like I'm the biggest horror game aficionado. In fact, unless it's the best rated horror game out there, probably gonna stay away from it because I have enough anxiety in my life to deal with, and I don't need a subpar spookfest adding to that. There are a number of horror games out there to test out, but let me save you some of the trouble as I give you the list of the top 10 worst horror games you should avoid. At number 10, Saw 2, Flesh and Blood. Now I know I said that I wasn't a fan of horror games, but I am, however, a fan of horror movies, the Saw franchise being one of my favorites. They're not the greatest things to come from Hollywood, and they are in no way the best cinematic masterpieces out there, but there's just something about the twisted nature of the films and how they all connect on an eerie level that is somehow pleasing to me and a number of other fans. But all that praise for the franchise certainly does not include the 2010 game Saw 2 Flesh and Blood. This game was merely seen as a failed cash grab to keep fans of the franchise satisfied, but they clearly satisfied none, as this game is seen as one of the worst horror games of the last decade. Being the second game that they've released, there was an expectation to up the ante in the game's sequel. Unfortunately, this isn't the case here, as the developers seriously dropped the ball on this one. The first game had tasks to progress the story and unlock clues, having unpredictable missions and minigames thrown in, but the sequel didn't really bring much more to the table. The tasks in the game were seen as pretty trivial and predictable, and much easier than the first game, and the story's plot was confusing to those who weren't familiar with the Saw movies because it provided no backstory for new players. The gore that you would expect from the Saw franchise is present, so it has that going for it, as it features the traps and bloody messes that you would expect in the movie. Really, this game was only enjoyed by superfans of the Saw franchise because they were just happy to have received something new, even if it wasn't all that enjoyable. At number 9, Juna, the Grudge. Yet another example of a failed attempt at bringing a movie into the gaming world is Juna, the Grudge. Released in 2009 on the Wii, Juna, the Grudge was marketed as a haunted house simulator because you can barely even call it a game. The overall consensus of those who played it is basically that the game's poor graphics, presentation, and gameplay are all subpar, but since the game has a really short playtime, it's not so bad since you won't really be wasting much time on it anyway. In the game, you are faced with ghost encounters as you wander around the dark halls of a number of creepy, stereotypical horror environments like abandoned buildings and whatnot. The game has quick time events where you fight off ghosts, but it's an overall pretty easy game to win, as long as you keep your flashlight powered with batteries that you'll find around the map, since that's really all you got going for you. There are no weapons, no health bar, and nothing to heal yourself with, so if the ghost catches you and you fail to fight them off in the quick time actions, you're dead. Game over. Even though the game was released in 2009, there were still a number of more engaging things that the developers could have added to make the game, well, a game, instead of just having 3 hours of wandering around a dark building. The game also has no checkpoint system, so if you die after 10 minutes of playing, you'll have to do it all again from the beginning, and you'll never get that time back. Even though the director of the original Grudge film helped to develop the game, there was really no saving it from being as bad as it was. Now, before I continue off the list, I'd like to ask you guys to consider leaving a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, because we love getting your positive feedback, and your support really means a lot to us. At number 8, Juna, Morbus, Gravis. Based on the graphic novel of the same name, Juna, Morbus, Gravis, released in 2001, wasn't really what fans of the novel were expecting. Now, I'd feel bad for harping on its poor graphics just because the game was released almost 20 years ago, and they obviously cannot even begin to compare with today's games, but for game reviewers at the time of its release, it had other glaring problems, mainly the game's overall execution. The premise of the game was that you have to enter Juna's psyche as she lies in a coma. As you wander through her mind, you have to take into account the fragility of her psyche, and 3 aspects are added to the game that the player has to be mindful of. Juna's cognitive efforts, which measure the time that the player has spent in her mind, her cardiac activity, which rises during stressful situations, and her nervous tension, which rises when the other 2 aspects change. These things never reset, so you have to play the entire game keeping these levels in mind, and if they get too high, then you lose. Basically, the game is just setting up to lose in this case because there's no way of regulating these levels. Players have jokingly said that they'd rather save their own psyche by avoiding the pain that comes with playing this game, which is probably some good advice to follow. At number 7, Holo. Holo, a game released in 2017, is one that you'd want to stay away from as long as you don't mind an immense amount of bugs, disorienting graphics, and typos. Being a game that was released not too long ago, you would think that it would have more going for it in regards to functionality, but this game, according to some reviewers, is an example of one that probably should have been scrapped long ago. The premise of the game is that you wake up, disoriented on a seemingly abandoned spacecraft, but you later find out that there are hellish monsters out to get you. This game is pretty low res and features a distorted filter that's supposed to mimic a space helmet. This really doesn't make the game very playable because it makes it hard for players to distinguish quest items and important markers from the rest of the grainy surroundings. The controls are also pretty choppy and lethargic, which could be interpreted as a creative call to further the idea that the character you're playing as is still disoriented and confused, but for those who've played the game, they say that these low quality functions are just frustrating to work with. The story is also subpar because it's pretty predictable and doesn't make it worth the trouble of dealing with the rest of the bugs, like the floors not loading, the game constantly crashing, and a number of other issues. At number 6, Shellshock 2 Blood Trails. This game is a Warzone zombie shooter in a saturated market of Warzone zombie shooter games. Shellshock 2 Blood Trails follows the main character, Nate Walker, who's shipped off to the front lines during the Vietnam War, and upon getting to a station, he finds that his brother and countless others have turned into brain-munching zombies. So what do? Well, you shoot your way to the end and try to piece together what happened. You play through jungles, tunnels, and villages plastered with blood streaks and displayed corpses before reaching the end of the game. It's a decent game, visually speaking, with its gory aspects making it a truly horrifying game, but the story itself and the functionality of the game leaves the player wanting more. You periodically mow down your zombie enemies, and sometimes hear the distant claps of gunfire, but other than that, it's pretty meh. On the bright side, the gameplay only lasts about 4 hours, so if you're looking for something to do when you're really just bored out of your mind, then you can try playing this for the afternoon, but if you're looking for some social interaction at the same time, you can definitely forget that since this game has no multiplayer function. There are definitely better games out there, so you're better off playing those instead. At number 5, Weeping Doll. If you're into VR gaming, this is definitely one game that you'll want to stay away from. Weeping Doll, released in 2016 for the PlayStation VR, really just should not have been released. If the developers gave it more time and worked on it a little more, then it could have been pretty good, but instead it flopped. The game's story is a little confusing and has some inconsistencies, but essentially the game follows a maid working for a dysfunctional family. This dark family scenario features a creepy dollmaker dad and weird, sad child, and a lot of family tension. As if the story itself wasn't bad enough, the voice acting is even worse.
Once upon a time, there were 2 twin sisters who lived in a big house with their parents. The sisters looked very much alike, except
the house where the game is set is also riddled with inconsistencies that really makes it hard to determine where and when the game takes place. The game seemingly takes place in a Victorian-esque home, but the bedrooms are laid out in a more traditional Asian style with samurai swords as decoration. Also, despite the fact that the main character wears more classical clothing, they're seen carrying a cell phone on them. The home also features CRT televisions in some rooms, but the walls are also decorated with fairy lights. It seems like the game was made by a bunch of different people who never had a meeting to discuss their work, and it's just bad. At number 4, Agony. Agony is a dark fantastical game released in 2018 that takes a player on a journey through the fiery depths of hell. Now, although the plot might intrigue you, don't let it fool you because according to a lot of players, it's actually pretty trash. It certainly fits the horror genre because of its serious gore factor featuring mangled victims and torture, but I mean, what else would you expect from a game that takes place in hell? Well, I mean, I'd expect some real action, but unfortunately, that doesn't happen in this game. Essentially, the objective here is to escape hell by using stealth, but as you could imagine, that can get old quite quickly. I love a good stealth mission, but if that's all the game offers, it's bound to get quite stale. Instead of running into the inferno and fighting demons, you're instead hiding and trying to sneak past guards who are on the hunt for you. This is all tied in with a seriously over-sexualized surrounding with a number of references to female anatomy and female sexuality as well. Essentially, the game's developers spent more time adding the screams of tortured souls and the graphic adult content than they did creating the playable parts of the game. At number 3, Alone in the Dark, Illumination. This game is horrific in the worst way possible. As the 6th installment of the Alone in the Dark franchise, you would think that the developers would at least try to spice things up a little bit, right? I mean, the other games in the franchise weren't all that great, but they weren't as bad as the latest installment, Illumination. Basically, these games featured the player alone in the dark. Surprising, I know. And fighting back against the monsters that are trying to kill you. It's all very reminiscent of Resident Evil, but they still made these games sort of work, at least until the latest one came out. The only thing that really changed with this one is the fact that these creatures of the night are now sensitive to light, and so your objective this time round is to light up your surroundings to keep the monsters at bay. Sort of like torching your base in Minecraft. Well, it's pretty dumb game mechanics pretty much makes the task of lighting your way obsolete, since the monsters still spawn around you and continue to attack you. It's a dumb game mechanic in a dumb game with a hell of a lot of bugs, so just take my advice and don't play it. At number 2, Amy. Imagine a game where you're trying to save someone who really doesn't need saving to begin with. That's pretty much the premise of the game Amy, and yes, it is as bad as it sounds. The story is much like The Last of Us in the sense that you're on a mission to save and protect a child from the dangers that lurk around you, but with Amy, your efforts to save this child are pretty much pointless because she's actually immune to the threat at hand. Amy is a mute child who is genetically enhanced thanks to experiments that she was subjected to, and when Amy and her guardian Lana seek out treatment for the child, they realize that they're in danger because of a zombie outbreak. Now they have to escape the facility that they were visiting and get to safety, but even though the player is at stress level 1000 trying to win the game with its clunky controls, and Lana is trying everything she can to keep Amy safe, Amy's just over there chilling because she's some kind of X-Men child who doesn't care that the zombies are after her. It's a hard game to take seriously, so you should just steer clear of it. And finally at number 1, The Letter. I put this game at number 1 just because of how utterly ridiculous it is, but also because I wanted to read you a review I found of this game that'll pretty much put into perspective and also make you laugh a bit. Basically, the premise of The Letter, a game released on the Wii U in 2014, follows a child's journey to locate their dad after finding a letter from him saying that he's gotten into some trouble and that it's too late to save him, but also that he's at a job site and if you go looking for him, you won't survive. Obviously, the character tries to find their dad regardless, and they keep finding clues, which is funny since the dad didn't want to be found in the first place. Make up your mind, Dad. The game is so poorly made graphically that it looks like something a beginner using Unity would have made their first time. The game can be completed in under 20 minutes, and it's not even worth your time, even though that time is short. It's so bad that one reviewer said, quote, "No one intentionally made this. I refuse to believe someone intentionally let this loose on the public. The only explanation is someone at Nintendo wanted to check the quality control testers at the Nintendo eShop, and an entire department is about to lose their jobs." Now, if that doesn't tell you that this game is criminally bad, I don't know what will. Now, I want you guys to tell me down in the comments what your favorite horror game is, and if you're not a horror fan, then what is your favorite game in general? Maybe you'll find someone down in the comments who shares a similar interest with you. But anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching and for sticking around all the way until the end of the video. I've been your host, Bea Room, and until next time, stay safe out there and stay awesome. Bye, guys.